Welcome back to This Was Supposed to Be Easy, your go-to podcast for connection, joy, and a good dose of laughter.
Hosted by two friends who've seen enough of life to know that it's never as simple as it sounds
or looks.
Each conversation celebrates the diverse journeys we travel, the moments of bravery, the strength we didn't know we had, and the joy we find along the way.
Because let's be honest, life is full of things that were supposed to be easy, but turned out to be harder.
And definitely funnier
than we thought. This is Amy.
And this is Cheryl. And if it were easy, we wouldn't be here. Amy, in a very recent conversation that we had recording this podcast, we started to talk about a book that you finished called The 7-Year Slip. And I almost laugh a little bit because I called it the 7-minute slip. I think I've called it the 7-day slip, which I think speaks a lot about the whole conversation that followed about our use of time and perception of time. But I started thinking about that conversation and how we really didn't go into the topic of the book itself beyond your original introduction to what the book was about. And it just made me think a lot about being a reader and how much time I would want to spend reading books versus how much time and even the space between times that I actually choose to read books. And so I'm hoping today that we can have a conversation about, we both, I think, consider ourselves as readers, just talk about what that looks like, what that feels like with all of the other things going on in our lives. And maybe I will start by asking you this question, which is, have you ever felt guilty sitting down to read?
Well, so one of the things that I have taken to doing, and I've never felt guilty to sit down to read, but I have maybe felt a little guilty at times herkle-derkling, which I have talked about before, like the Scottish term of like lollygagging in bed, like after being awake. That is one of my favorite times to read. And so I think about that, and maybe I kind of like hear all the things going on in the house, and I'm like, I'm going to stay in bed and read just a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
That is definitely one of my favorite times. In fact, yesterday, I was really close to finishing a book. And so I ended up staying in bed well after everybody had kind of done some stuff, and then realized like, oh, I really had to get moving. And I had like 20 pages left in the book. And so I ended up being able to finish it last night. But where I do feel some issue is that how much I love reading and how that's oftentimes one of the first things I give up when life gets busy.
Yeah. And I think you give it's almost like the creativity urge that I've talked about before, right? You give it up long enough and start to have this bubbling, I start to have this bubbling need. Like I just need to read. And I think that speaks to maybe having an identity of being a reader. It's something I have loved since childhood. I think if I go out to my cottage, I can open a particular cupboard out there and my entire collection of Nancy Drew books is out there. My series of books that go with Little Women, because a lot of people don't know that Little Women has other books with the same
I did not know this.
Yeah, I can think of one called Joe's Boys. I'd have to look to see the rest, but yeah, there's more out there. So anyway, it's deeper than a hobby. It really is I think, a part of who I am. I do feel like this sense of disconnection from myself if I'm not reading. And that can come in a lot of different forms. Amy, we've talked about the kinds of books that we like, and it's really vast, right? It's really wide. Like, for example, if you ask me who my favorite author is, my answer is immediately Nora Roberts. So that is directly in the fiction world. However, if you look behind me over my head, there's this huge collection of very colorful books that are there on that particular shelf because they are more nonfiction, personal development, growth focused kinds of books. There's a big line, which is not the word I want, but difference between the types of books that I like to read.
Well, I would say the same thing for myself. So, thinking about all the different genres that are out there, I would even add to that, I interact in my reading different depending on the different type of book I'm reading. So,
Mhm.
I know I've mentioned this to you before, but like, I would even say this to our listeners if they're thinking, like, I want to be a reader, but oh my gosh, sitting down in the traditional sense of reading is never the way I'm going to choose to spend my time. Like, I know for myself, I love a good romance fantasy, Fourth Wing, like those types of books. And those I can sit down and I can read. Like, I also different types of, I almost call them kind of more like easy reading stories that you can get involved. But I also love a good self-help, psychology, growth,
Mhm.
business type of book. Now, those I have a much harder time sitting down and reading. But where I can listen to them is I love audiobooks. And
Mhm.
so when I'm getting ready in the morning, when I hop into my car, if I have to drive more than 10 minutes somewhere, if I am cleaning the house, like I'm doing something, I
Mhm.
can put that on. I often listen to it at like 1.5 speed. So I'm listening to it quite sped up, but it feels almost like the same way I interact with a podcast, right? And a lot of times those books are often being read by their authors, which I love,
Yep.
because they'll like add little nuance and stories and things like that. It feels like it gives me a chance to interact with it a little bit differently. And so I love being able to do that. And in turn, often have two, three, it's nothing for me to have four books going at
Mhm.
any time because maybe I have a book that I'm actually physically reading that if I'm sitting in the living room and, my family's watching TV and it's something I don't want to watch, I could flip through, I could read. I often have at least one or two audiobooks that I'm listening to again while I'm getting ready. I'm in the car. And sometimes I have a book that like, that's kind of like the slow book that I'm going through before I go to bed. I read a couple of pages every night.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and that's never been an issue for me, but I do find that having started this doctoral program last year, like reading and enjoying reading when I am in a busy class, because I'm reading coursework so often or reading books for coursework, I find that I really struggle then to actually read for enjoyment.
Yeah, I think it gets harder to do that same action, right, of reading when you've done it so much for research, for understanding, for work that you have to be doing versus for pleasure. And I like that not only, sometimes I like to think about which kind of reading fuels me or fills up my cup the most. But I think it depends, right? They're just like the way that you interact with it can help you in different ways. I love that you brought up listening to the author in their own voice because you get little extra stories sometimes. And you just reminded me when I listened to Brene Brown's most recent book, she steps out all the time. Like if you're reading a Brene Brown book, you're getting the book, you're reading it word for word. But if you're listening to Brene Brown read a book, she will very consistently say, now I'm going to step away for a minute and just tell you this story or tell you why it's here in this part of the book, which you almost lose or miss out on if you're reading the hard copy. So I love kind of having that insider knowledge. If it's a Brene Brown book, I might want to own it because I want to take notes or mark things or reference later, but I definitely want to listen to it as well.
I will say though, like, so unless you're part of something like Audible or a service, I feel like in some ways it's harder to get an Audible book or like a audiobook than it is sometimes to get a physical hold in my hand book.
Do you mean like from the library?
Yeah, I mean, like from the library because the wait line is huge. But also,
Mhm.
if I want to go buy a book, I know I have a cute little bookstore here in town. there's a Barnes and Noble about a half hour away from me. I know I can easily order something on Amazon if I was going to, or even go, if it's a popular read, I can go to any store, Meijer, Target, Walmart, like Sam's Club, all of those types of things that sell books. I could buy a book. Where to get an audiobook and have the ability to listen to it, um, more often than not, back in the day, you could go and like buy the CD copy, of a book and listen to it. That's not the case anymore. That's not what I'm saying I want to do. I want to be able to stream it. And I know though that there are fewer, it's not as convenient to just
Yeah.
buy a streaming. And so I find that the majority of the streaming that I listen to are from like the library or things like that because it is
Mhm.
so much easier. But then in turn, there's usually a lot longer wait lines. There's,
Yeah.
different things that go along with that.
So when I say the library, there's also, different apps that you can use connected to your library or whole library systems. Sometimes, yes, I will put my name as number 36, in line
Yeah,
for the book and have totally forgotten about it by the time, it gets to my turn. Fortunately, they send you an alert, but it is why I caved recently and did subscribe to Audible. So at least once a month, I get a credit where I can choose any book I want and immediately get it added to my phone while I might be waiting for something that's going to take a bit longer to get. The other thing you made me think about is that sometimes if I have listened to a good audiobook, and Brene Brown again will be my example, I used Audible to listen to her newest book so that I wouldn't have to wait in line. Sometimes what I then do is just go to my library list of audiobooks and type in her name and see what might be immediately available that's older that I haven't read and upload that or download that so that I can keep going on that pathway if I'm excited about it.
that's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to jump back for a quick second about time because you were talking about, you can sit down and read all day if it's a romance novel or something like that, and talk about that circling back to time conversation that we had very recently. Because one of the times that I feel like it's almost like flow, right? Like when you're creating and you go into flow or you're engaged in something that's really exciting to you, I know that's going to happen to me if I read a Nora Roberts book, right? So I know that if I pick up and start a Nora Roberts book, I will not want to do anything else until it's finished. And sometimes and I always buy a hard copy of her books. Sometimes I'll have her book for more than a month, more than 2 months before I give myself the gift of opening the cover because I don't want it to be something that's stopping me from a really fun weekend with family members from out of town, right? Like I don't want those two things to be fighting with each other. And so
Mhm.
I'll wait until I'm like, no, this weekend is coming where I can just like do nothing but read that book. So I love that a book can do that for me, that it can take me away from whatever my current reality is and I can just fully become a part of what's happening in that story. And it really does warrant a conversation about why reading matters for us. Not just I have to read because I need to gather information and build my knowledge about this certain thing that's coming up in my professional world, but also just like why reading matters to us as humans that love to read. There are benefits for us.
One of even the benefits I think that has been so interesting is reading can really give you the perspective of somebody else that you might not know,
Mhm.
in that like, and I'm talking about in kind of any capacity. So maybe it's a autobiography or a biography, but also maybe it's a story, a fiction book, but still you're getting the perspective of somebody who has a lived experience that's totally different from you.
Mhm.
And you don't always get to have conversations with people that might have experienced something like that. I mean, I think of, a good murder mystery or something, like I always think about when I'm reading something like the psychology aspect of like what was going through this person's mind. And I also think with a book too, that's so amazing is oftentimes it shares what the person was thinking as they were doing
Hmm.
whatever it is that they were doing. Meeting a meet cute, meeting somebody new. They were, yes, committing a murder. They were, going to a different country. They were exploring themselves. And I think about with any book in an everyday life, we are not privy to individuals' thoughts.
Right.
But in a
Right.
book, we are. And so it kind of gives us a look into different people and different thoughts that could be happening when something is going on or something is different.
It's a different version of that whole broaden and build, right? Like we're expanding our horizons without actually meeting that person or having that much time with someone in that profession or in that part of the world. It's interesting to think of it, in that expansion, broaden and build sort of model that we talk about in lots of other ways, but not necessarily when we're thinking about books. It also I've learned or noticed, I guess, maybe as I get a little older that I can't. So there are places where I could listen to a book, for example. You mentioned driving in the car. That is often where I'll be listening, most of the time, where I'll be listening to an audiobook. You also mentioned getting ready in the morning. I was finishing an audiobook called The Midnight Library that I started when I was traveling, right? So I knew I was going to be in an airplane. I might want to close my eyes. And so watching a movie was maybe a solution for part of the trip, but not all of the trip. And so I downloaded this book that people were talking to me about when we were at our conference a few weeks ago. And it's called The Midnight Library so that I could listen to it with my eyes shut on the airplane. And so I started it on my trip and on my travels, and I finished it this weekend while I was cleaning the bathroom, right? So I could be scrubbing the shower walls and listening to the audiobook, but I couldn't be sitting at my computer and grading or sitting at my computer and working on receipts from the trip that I just finished because when my mind is focused on numbers or reading students' work, it can't also be listening to whatever is happening in that book. And so I am learning a lot about myself in terms of when and where I'm able to let my mind go to that experience or go to that story because it doesn't need to be doing anything else. And I guess I say all of that just because I think reading really it helps us focus. And it's taught me when I can't divide my focus. There's so many times where we're trying to pay attention to a lot of things at the same time. And if I really want to hear what's happening in the story or in the book, regardless of the kind of book it is, I have to be able to focus on that. And I think it's a good practice these days, any days, but especially these days to focus, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, because I think about this, if I'm alone in the car, I'm going to listen to an audiobook. If
Hmm.
I'm with someone in the car, I'm not going to listen to an audiobook because the likelihood is that we would be talking off and on, and I don't want to split my focus
Yeah.
because I either want to listen to the story or I want to talk with the person. I also think, like you just mentioned, being on a plane and closing your eyes.
Mm.
I need to make sure that if I'm closing my eyes, I'm not so tired that I'm going to fall asleep and miss a whole chapter
Yeah.
because it's just kind of that noise in the back of my head.
Although I will tell you, sorry, I'm interrupting, but I
No,
will
no,
tell you,
go
I,
ahead.
I have a friend who travels on the experiences that I offer, and she does that every night. Every night she falls asleep with an audiobook going. And
Okay.
when she wakes up in the morning, she thinks about what she can remember last and she starts backtracking to different chunks in the book until she hears something she remembers. And then she knows where to start again that next day. So we all have our different strategies.
And I did recently just do that. Now, the other thing too that I think with audiobooks that can sometimes be really helpful is, I mentioned reading like Fourth Wing. And this is a great book series, very like the romantic fantasy type of thing. But the names of the dragons in that book are quite expansive and not necessarily an English word.
Hmm.
So I liked listening to the first one to be able to get the names of the dragons, like in the way
Yes.
that it's pronounced. Or I like that a lot of audiobooks now in that kind of genre are almost doing it like play, and that our love of
Hmm.
plays, where it's a multicast reading.
Okay.
So there's many characters that are all being read by different people with
Hmm.
like actual the background and things like that. So it almost feels like so then when I'm listening to it, and especially if I'm listening to it the first time through, I can almost get like, okay, this is what this person sounds like. This is like the dialect. This is all those things. So then if I go on and read then the next few books in the series instead of listening to them, I already have that like laid out in my head. So then I'm kind of ready to go. It's like it primed it. It set that
Yes.
foundation almost in the same way that if you are to, let's say, read a story and then you go in and watch the movie, you're like, well, that person didn't look that way. That person didn't sound that way in my head. Like, all of those types of things.
Yeah.
So I like to kind of, depending on what I'm doing, I like to do that first. So then I'm not questioning it by the second one, being like, that's not what that person sounds like. What are they
Yeah.
talking about?
I absolutely love that strategy, especially with like Nora Roberts uses a lot of Irish locations and characters. And so hearing the names pronounced is so, so helpful for me setting my own image of that character. Love, love, love it. So reading gives us escape. It helps us understand other people. It helps us understand other ideas, other cultures. It can help us focus when our attention is often very distracted. I think it helps me build empathy. But I did come across a little fact, which is that even 6 minutes of reading can lower your heart rate. So I think of that when I'm
Mm.
thinking about stress too. And, that reading is not just for fun, I guess, not just for reward, but literally there are some helpful ways that it helps enrich our lives. It helps keep our bodies maybe even a little bit healthier. I just love reminding myself that it's good. It's good to read. It's an important thing to add to your day. And when I come across some of the barriers that I come across, I need to speak to myself a little bit and tell myself that there might be real reasons why we forget to read. There are real barriers to why we slip into time periods where we aren't allowing ourselves to read or feeling like we don't have enough time to read. And so I think it would be helpful, Amy, if we just talk about a few of those barriers, just because I think naming them is a way for us to maybe clap back at it a little bit and realize that while we love reading, our lives aren't necessarily designed to protect the space and the time for reading. And acknowledging it can help us be more in tune to our need for reading and our love for reading and all of the good things that it does for us. And so I guess I would just start by throwing one out there, which is, when do I have enough time? When do I have enough time to get sucked into this book that I know is going to be so good that I don't want to do anything else? And so, feeling like my time is very fragmented might be a barrier that I have to think about. And especially like literally this weekend, when I finished the Midnight Library, I immediately did a search on what are the 10 best books I need to read in 2026. And the very top one said, this is one where you will skip dinner because you don't want to stop reading it, kind of thing. And so I just want to name that barrier of time fragmentation and say that I'm going to fight against it. How does that sound?
I think that sounds great. I would also say for myself, so it kind of is in lane with the time fragmented, but it also is that schoolwork piece for me.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
like competing priorities. So not even that like, oh, I know I'm going to have a lot of different little things to do, but it's the priorities that I have to do, I know will be that much harder if I'm also thinking about how much I would rather read.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of that prioritization. Like I have to prioritize schoolwork for this weekend versus being able to be lost in a book.
Yeah.
Because if I even started the book, I wouldn't be able to prioritize the schoolwork because I know I'm going to have to do this.
You know
So
yourself.
so though I just right now, what I do to work with that is every time I hear about a good book, I jot it down. And then when I know I have a little bit of time, that's what I'm going to fall into. And
Hmm.
so for me, the way that I can kind of prioritize or think about that is that I know for myself, I would rather read a book or listen to a book over, let's say, watching TV.
Hmm.
So if that comes, if I'm going to either sit down in the living room and have the time to watch a movie, and it's not that I'm doing that as an activity with my spouse or I'm doing that as an activity with my child, like my child, where I really should be there doing that, then I'm going to prioritize reading the book because I have an open couple of hours.
Hmm. I am thinking about memories of, I don't know, evenings, days that feel sort of magical. And it rarely involves watching a movie or a show on my TV at home, even though that is what I do often with my spouse in the evenings. But if I picture myself laying on the couch with maybe some big band music playing, and it's cold outside and the fire's crackling and I'm reading a book, or it's summer and it's raining outside, that feels magical, right? Like just laying there with that music playing, reading a book is a memory I'm going to take forward. And so that thought just randomly popped into my head as you were comparing it to, TV watching versus choosing to read a book. And I'd like to remind myself that, sometimes on those free evenings, hey, we don't have to turn on the TV. Let's read for a little bit. And Kevin will tell me sometimes, well, if I start reading, I'm going to fall asleep. That exhaustion sort of idea. And then we end up picking up our phones and scrolling through our phones instead. And I'm going to circle back, I'm going to take myself back to, hey, let's do this, even if maybe I'm throwing a strategy out there right now. But, if we feel like we're too tired to read or we don't have enough chunk of time to read, if we have enough time to watch TV, yeah, maybe even once a week, let's try to make sure we read instead. I don't know. It feels like I would be happier if I made that a priority in some way.
I think so too. One of the things that I think about a lot when it comes to reading, and again, maybe this is kind of that technique thing. I love reading on vacation, and
Hmm.
I know there's people that would argue with me about that in saying like, well, but you're in a new city or you're in a different place. Like, why would you could read anytime? Like, why aren't you out exploring and things like that? And I would say because so much of my time is accounted for when I'm at home. I am in a phase of my life where so much of my time is accounted for that, like, when I am on a vacation and I am not being pulled in 900 different directions,
Hmm.
like, laying around and reading for a couple hours is ideally. I remember, in fact, being in New Zealand, I had a couple of days on my own. And in
Yes.
fact, one of the mornings I woke up because, sleep for that whole week was messed up anyway. But I remember being there and kind of laying around for a good chunk of the morning and just reading. And there was a part of me that said, like, oh, I should get up. I should go, explore part of the city, like what I'm going to do. And I eventually did do that for a good remainder of the day. But that whole morning of getting up and reading a book that I was really into and excited about, and just getting to kind of look out the window and have the sun come in a little bit, like that was actually probably one of my favorite things because I wasn't overly committed. And I
Yeah.
think that, and there wasn't that competing. And so I think too that like a vacation of even just being able to read and not have competing forces happen is equally amazing to me.
Yeah. Well, we recently talked about the way I travel and how it's not just jam packed with lots of things, but also big chunks of time to get to know the space. And you are absolutely right. Reading is rest, it's restful. vacation should also be restful. So why wouldn't those two things go together? I have thousands of memories of loving camping when I was younger. I haven't camped in a while, but loving camping because for me, going on a camping weekend was a lot about sitting around the fire reading a book or laying in a chair by the pool or at the beach reading a book. I do not go to the beach without a book in my bag because that's part of the magic of that time, that rest. Absolutely. Those two things I think go together. So let's talk about some of these strategies a little bit more, right? Like we've talked about using audiobooks while we're driving, while we're cleaning, while we're getting ready in the morning, when we're alone, right? It's not something for when we're in shared space with other people. I also really want to move my body a little bit more, and walking is a way that feels good to me right now in this phase of life. And when I say right now, I don't mean right now in March in northern Michigan, because there's a lot of ice and slush and mud and snow in my way. But going on a walk is also a perfect combination or stackable opportunity for listening to an audiobook, because I might not let myself listen to the book unless I'm driving or walking. And so it makes me want to walk a little bit more, but also it makes the distance I walk or the amount of time I've committed to the walk move so much more quickly because I'm listening to a book and am sort of, transported to another place, or even transported to thinking about different ideas that I didn't necessarily understand prior to listening to the book. And so one of those strategies, I think, is truly using audiobooks and stacking them into those time periods when we're alone and when we're working.
So I guess then this would be a great time too to ask our listeners, when do you find times to read? And are you kind of, and we know we have listeners in all different phases of our life. Is it challenging? Go to our socials and share, when do you love to find time to read, and how do you prioritize that? And then maybe if you're not someone who enjoys reading, do you want to be? And then you can kind of read through what other people say, or what do you enjoy? And I would love to know too, what are our listeners reading right now? What should
Yeah.
we pick up? What are some of the fun things that are happening? Is there a book that we shouldn't miss, or an opportunity to think about something in a cool and new way? Thanks for tuning in to This Was Supposed to Be Easy. Remember, the best stories are the ones we live.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep the conversation going, because life may not be easy, but listening in should be.
Stay curious, stay connected, and keep wondering.